Hey everybody, welcome to our Activated Thursday series where every Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific, we have IG Live conversations with youth and adults about how to be effective activists. I'm Avery Smedley. I'm a student activist myself in Montgomery County. I am the lead organizer for Students Toward Equitable Public Schools. We work to further education equity and fight de facto segregation in our school district. And today I'm so excited to be with Todd Hasak-Lowy, writer and professor of We Are Power, How Nonviolent Activism Changes the World. It's a really great book. And I'm just waiting for Todd to join.
Hello, hello.
Hi, how are you?
Doing?
Good, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for having me. Am I
Yeah,
am I
thanks for
coming
coming.
through clearly here?
Yeah.
Awesome. Is this Avery? Are you
Yeah,
Avery?
yeah.
Nice to meet you.
You too. I really loved your book. It was so interesting, such a good read, and I think it's really important for everybody to read because I think people need to have a more in-depth understanding of how to make our democracy work best for them and how to use the system. Why
Well,
were you Oh, sorry,
I
go ahead.
couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And let me just say how exciting it is for me when the exact intended audience of the book reads the book and then connects to it. You work on a book by yourself for a while and you don't know what's going to happen with it or who it's going to get to. So when I knew that you had read it and I saw what you wrote about it, I was like, yes, this person totally got it. And that was
Yes.
super gratifying. Really, really gratifying.
And it's so timely too because I'm a student activist. I've done a few marches myself and I've been things I feel like are really starting up in these last few years especially. So it really was close to me as well, especially because it really affirmed for me that nonviolent activism is so important and it is actually effective because I've heard so many things from my peers saying things like, why do you even march? Marching doesn't matter. So the MLK section really spoke to me specifically when you talked about how children were such a vital part of the nonviolent movement, and we actually owe so much to them in terms of the civil rights movement. I had no idea. I don't know why information like that isn't more common, but it really affirmed to me how important it is. But what would you say to those kids who say that marching doesn't matter?
Well, I would say a bunch of things. I mean, first of all, I think to back up a teeny bit, you were talking about oh, I thought I knew the story of the civil rights movement and all this. I think what happens typically, and I think the civil rights movement's a good example, is we get a really simplified story. And you're like, oh, Martin Luther King Jr., I have a dream, ended segregation. And when you actually look closely at his story, you see it's much more complicated. And in that story, you actually found out that as much as he did all this amazing work, that he actually needed to sort of be saved by other activists. And in this case, it was children, it was young people. So what would I say to young people who think oh, this is stupid, it's not going to do anything, it's not going to make a difference? I think the basic law or rule of nonviolent activism and why it works is that you need numbers and you need people willing to be disruptive. And when you have those two things, you have a tool that's really, really powerful. And we see that in that chapter of Birmingham, is that once they allowed thousands of young people to march and go to jail, it actually broke the system in Birmingham, right? So they had a system in place that one of the ways we're going to keep segregation in place is that if you break the rules, you go to jail. Well, you can't send in a city of that size that many people to jail, and it breaks the system down. And then when people continue to march, right, they famously, and everybody's familiar with these images of the fire hose and the dogs, they had to use other methods to try and get the marchers and the protesters to go home. And those backfired as well because the people were willing to suffer. And so I think when you talk to young people and somebody says, well, I'm only 14 years old or whatever, and I can't make a difference, I think what people have to understand is that if enough of you get together and work together as a unit, then you do make a difference. You make a huge difference. And I think we were really seeing that with the climate strikes and the climate marches. Obviously, things are in this kind of weird space right now with the shelter in, but those marches were radically changing the profile of that movement. in a relatively short amount of time. I mean, when I started writing the book, I didn't know who Greta Thunberg was. Nobody knew who she was. She was
Right.
this anonymous kid in Sweden. And in less than a year, she went from one person going on strike to like 7 million people around the world. And there's no question that, again, had things not changed the way they had, there was going to be a march in April. It would have been bigger than the other ones. And
Right.
so I think it's easy to feel like I'm just one person and what I do myself doesn't matter. And I think there is some truth to that as an activist. If it's just you, it's going to be limited. But if you and all your friends and all your friends' friends and all the people across town and everything, like if they get together, then you do make a difference. So,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
I think what was so shocking to me, are you familiar with the political scientist Erica Chenoweth and her finding that it only takes like 3.5% of the population to make change like that, actually make tangible changes?
Yeah. I mentioned her at the end of the book, and I mentioned her in that context. Is that your dog or my dog? We have a
That's
puppy.
my dog. I'm sorry, my dogs are so
No,
annoying.
that's fine. I was worried. We got a puppy 2 months ago, and she's totally insane. And I thought she was going to be barking, so it's great. I should bring her in here. She'd like to meet the dog. No, absolutely. I'm really familiar with her work, and I think it's really important. And I think, you look at that 3.5% number, and it's kind of both big and small at the same time. So in the United States, that would mean 11 million people, I think, which is a lot. I think at the last big climate strike in the United States, there was maybe around 1 million, maybe it was a little more, I can't remember. So it would need to grow considerably from that, but it's not an amount that's unimaginable. And I think that it is really a matter of being persistent with the numbers and being persistent with one's dedication. I mean, one thing I learned from this, and I suppose there are exceptions, but it requires patience. Change doesn't happen overnight. And so it's important to realize if you're getting into this, that it might take a little while. Things aren't going to happen, right away, but you can make change.
Absolutely. Do you have a personal connection to activism?
So I don't really, I came to this, or I should say I didn't at the time. I came to this very much as a kind of a writer and a historian of sorts. I had written a book before this about women's suffrage movement called Roses and Radicals that I co-wrote with someone else. And I knew after I finished that project that I wanted to do something similar, and I was looking for people and causes and histories to write on that I thought would kind of be inspiring and uplifting for me in a very personal way. But I didn't know a ton about this before I started. But now that I have, I mean, now I really, some people are like, oh, you're a writer. That's so cool. How do you write books? But I look at activists and I'm like, oh, that's so cool. How do you do that? And so I've really tried as a person to kind of grow into that. And before things changed, I was doing stuff like I went to a sunrise training and just made food in the kitchen. And everybody's way younger than me anyways. But I'm trying to get involved. I've gone to some of the marches. My daughter, who is, I think, exactly your age, is really involved in climate stuff here in Evanston, where we live. So I'm trying to get involved. But my whole feeling about the topic changed really radically by writing this book. And I became much more excited and passionate about it as I worked on it.
So if you don't have the personal connection, what about activism is so appealing to you, just like so interesting?
Well, I think what happened is I was working on it. I was like, holy cow, this stuff works. It's amazing. These people are amazing. Like, why don't we know more about it? I mean, the way that I sort of open the book is to claim that I think we're taught history in a very incomplete way. And I think these activists are, someone like Cesar Chavez, to me, is every bit as amazing and as impressive as people that have been president and things like that. And so I think the other thing that really resonated with me, and I think this is really important in this moment where people are very angry and despondent and frustrated, is that there's I think the idealism in it is also really amazing. So on the one hand, it does get things done, but I think it's also a way to get things done in which kind of the best of us can come out, right? So obviously, a good example of that is Martin Luther King, but Gandhi as well, that it's a way to be in conflict with your opponent, but in a way that's not about your hatred of them. And it's not about you thinking they're worse than you. It's really about, I'm in conflict with an injustice. And we're all part of this unjust system, right? So when Martin Luther King Jr. is talking about all the children that are in prison, he says they're fighting to make this country a better place, right? He wasn't saying they're fighting to beat those white racists, right? Even though he definitely thought we're fighting a bunch of white racists, but he was really thinking we're here to make this country better. And everybody will benefit from that if we succeed. And I think if you look at climate stuff now, if you look at Black Lives Matter, I mean, it's all about how do we repair society? It's not about how do we win and you lose. And that to me is really appealing, because at this moment, and I assume many of the people listening and probably you, like, you will look at the news and you're filled with anger and you hate the president, you know, and all these things. And that it's natural and it's real, but it's a hard place to draw your energy from every day. Ultimately, it has to come from, what do you love? What do you care about? What do you believe in, right? What are you passionate about? And not what do you hate and what do you want to destroy? So that to me really spoke to me.
It's really amazing. I was actually reading something by Gandhi this morning. It was a letter to the Viceroy to India, and it was just so incredible to me how he's able to detach the British from the system itself. He never speaks to them with hatred. He speaks to them with like brotherly love, which is just like so insane to me, but also so inspiring at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I know the letter you're talking about, he opens it, he's like, dear friend.
Yeah.
That's how he addresses, and this is the person that's in charge of the whole colonial enterprise, you know. But I think ultimately, if you're going to really kind of go into battle metaphorically, you have to realize, like, that's a really powerful energy, and if you do it out of hatred, it's going to come out one way or the other.
Right.
So yeah.
And it was so surprising to me that nonviolent activism is actually more effective. I guess because, like you said, like, it requires so much patience, and it might not seem that way, but you do actually get the best results out of that. And I think
I think go ahead. What was that?
Oh, and I think that could be really appealing to people, because from the offset, it seems like because the violence gets faster results, it seems like that's more effective, but that's actually not true.
Well, and the other thing about, one of the reasons that nonviolence works better than violence is that the moment you're violent, you give your opponent permission to be violent in return. And since nonviolence is the method of the side that appears to be weaker, that means that invariably the other side is going to have more access to violence than you are. Right? So if you employ violence, you're kind of guaranteeing two things. One is that things are going to escalate in terms of violence and that you're going to really suffer. And then the other thing is that always in these conflicts, there's actually three sides. There's sort of you, and there's your opponent, and then there's everybody else who's just like, this isn't my fight. I happen to live in this country, but it's not my fight. And those people are paying attention whether or not they realize it. And if they see you being violent, they're like, those people are violent. They're just as bad. What do I care about them? But if they see you kind of in a principled way avoiding violence, and in fact accepting suffering, which is part of what happens, then you win over more support. And that's another reason why these movements are successful. So the farm workers movement managed to get 17 million people in North America to stop buying grapes. And these were quote unquote regular people that just, you know, would normally go into the supermarket to buy grapes. And suddenly, because they saw the way that the farm workers were fighting and were able to listen to their message as a result, decided, I'm going to join their side. Right. Even though I really like grapes. I'm not going to buy them, right? I'm going to give up grapes. I'm going to maybe go to different supermarkets, right? Because I like the way they're fighting.
Do you think that maybe our Constitution was designed to encourage activism, looking at things like the First Amendment, right to assemble, right to free speech, freedom of the press, things like that?
I think that's a really fascinating question. And I need to admit a little bit, I'm not an expert on the Constitution or that period of the United States, but I do have some thoughts about it. And one is that it's clear to me that those rights were established so that there would be a permanent space for people to disagree. And I think part of the reason for that was that there would be this permanent thing in place that would allow for change to happen, right? So you and I can talk and we can have different ideas and we can say what we think, and then people can go and vote. And it's a great system in many ways. It's certainly better than not having those things. I don't think any of us would want to live in a country that doesn't have freedom of speech or freedom of assembly. I think what's interesting about the nonviolent cases, especially the ones in my book and the ones in the United States, is that there are moments in which, for some reason or another, those things that are in the Constitution were inadequate. And they needed to sort of, people needed to sort of push them, right? Or they needed to show that, you know what, some speech isn't free and some assembly isn't free. So if you look at the suffrage movement, right, they want a right that they don't have, right? I want to vote, but I'm a woman, I'm not allowed to vote. So how do I get people that can vote decide to give me the vote? And so they start by just saying, give us the vote, give us the vote. And they do all these things that are allowed. They assemble, they give speeches, they write newspapers, but it doesn't work. And so at a certain point, and this is really all the stories I tell are interested in this moment, it's about people breaking rules to change rules. And that's at a certain point, a certain kind of activism that's using, like, here's what's built into the system, here's what's built into the government, here's what's built into the society and its laws. At a certain point, those are inadequate. And so you need to break the rules, but not with an eye on like making chaos and anarchy. It's actually, I'm going to break the rules so that you change the rules, right? So in other words, if we look at current moments, like people that are going on school strike, they're not going on school strike so there'll be no school. They're going on school strike so there'll be a point for them to go to school, right? And so it's that kind of back and forth between how does everybody want me to sort of, what's the routine, what's the status quo, and how do I break it so that people will listen to me and people will be forced to respond to the demands of me and my movement.
Right. So Americans definitely have like a unique, I guess, advantage in that way because it's been a part of our culture for so long. What other advantages do you think we have as Americans, and just in this day and age with technology? What other like advantages do activists have?
Well, I think technology cuts both ways a little bit. I think technology is really great for spreading the word. I think it's really good for people to educate themselves. I think it's really great for people, 25 years ago, there might be somebody living 3 miles from you, but they're in a different school district, and you would never know that they had the same interests as you. And so technology and social media in particular is really great for that. The danger of that stuff is there's a couple things. One is the people that are your kind of opponent have access to this stuff as well. And they might also have more money and more resources to use it in a way that is going to make your cause struggle. But the other thing, and I think this is more important, and I think we all sort of feel this right now, is that it's easy to feel like, oh, I retweeted this, I'm an activist, right? Or I liked your post on Instagram, I'm an activist. And I think, again, if we think about effective activism as being disruptive, Twitter, retweeting something is what Twitter wants you to do, right? Liking someone's Instagram post is what Instagram wants you to do. And not only that, they want you to be on Instagram. And so if we're really trying to make change, we have to move out of the digital space and into the analog three-dimensional real world. And we have to figure out ways to do it. I saw, again, ironically, on Instagram yesterday, some people from Sunrise Movement who had gone to some overpass. It looked like it was somewhere in Los Angeles area. And they had hung these giant banners over the freeway, and they were getting out their message that way. And something that I'm following right now that I'm finding really interesting is how people are finding ways to be activists out in the world right now, even with all the shelter in and everything. So that's one thing. I think the other advantage that we have right now, and this is one of the reasons that I wrote my book, and one of the reasons I'm hopeful that people read it, is that what we have right now is we have all this kind of research that's been done, like all these experiments that have been done. And anybody who wants to be an activist now, you're not starting from scratch. right? You have all these movements and all these activists that have come before you, and they've had their successes and failures, and you can look at what they've done and say like, oh, that worked, that didn't work, let's try this, let's try that. I think being part of a movement is always, there's kind of an improvisational feature to it. Is always this kind of creativity of like, well, that sort of worked, what can we do next? It wasn't like, again, like when Greta Thunberg started out, she didn't know that this thing that she was going to do was so replicable and could grow so much, right? And that's kind of an experiment that she started, and it's led to all this other stuff. So now the question is, all right, what's the next step? And one way to find answers to that question is by studying past successful movements. How did they grow? How did they continue doing stuff? So I think that's a big advantage that people have right now.
Right, right. Something that's so interesting about this time right now, we see so many movements, I guess also because we have to. It's not, I mean, it was the same back then. It's a matter of like life or death with things like climate change and just like our lives, and politicians not really like taking that into account. Do you think we're in the midst of like a social revolution right now, similar to maybe the 1960s?
I do. I do, and I've been trying to think about why I think that's the case. I think some of it has to do with more and more people finding the status quo unsatisfactory and sort of unsustainable. If you look at the 60s, you see this whole kind of cluster of things emerge at once in terms of race, in terms of the way this country was waging war, in terms of nuclear proliferation, and all these things that kind of came together, farm workers, women's rights, all at once, people saying the status quo is not acceptable. And there was this kind of giant ferment of all these movements that were learning together and were kind of energized from each other. And I think we're coming to the end of a period in which people were convinced for whatever reason, like, oh, things are essentially fine. And I think now you talk to young people and they're like, things aren't fine, right? Even if their parents are like, what's so bad? Like, kids understand, like, things are not fine. And so I think we are at a moment where if you look at income inequality, if you look at climate, if you look at continuing, you know, the criminal justice system, all these things, people are like, we need to do something. And I think it's a feeling that you were talking before about freedom of assembly and rights and things that are sort of built into our system. And I think there's also a sense, and this is really clear in the COVID, is that our institutions are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? They are failing us right now. And so what activists do, and especially kind of confrontational nonviolent activists, is they force the institutions to change, right? They come along and they say, you guys you either need to do your job or someone else is going to do your job. Right? And there's always this back and forth between, you know, so you have somebody like AOC who started as an activist and is now in the House of Representatives, right? And so there's always this movement of like, I'm outside of the system, I'm in the system. And I think I've been very impressed with the Sunrise Movement because they seem to have that built into their strategy, is we're going to agitate, right? We're going to occupy offices, but we're doing that so that legislation will get passed. We're doing that so people that we support running for office will win their elections. So there's always this back and forth. It's not about tearing down systems. It's about repairing them. And I think it's very clear in this moment right now, and the COVID has really, I think, brought that. I think a lot of us were like, I told you so. Like, I told you this was messed up. Right? But other people are seeing like, oh, we have really horrible inequality in this country in a million different ways. And I think it's also, people are saying like, oh, there's this whole other big crisis coming that's bigger than COVID. It's called the climate crisis. And I think everybody's like, we need to get our act together. And I think activists will really need to be a part of that, because politicians, elected officials are usually quite invested with not changing things too much.
Do you think kids are in a unique position to disrupt and be better activists?
Yes. I mean, one of the things we see, if we look at the history, is that, and so I have children that are your age and a little bit older, but we know kids are risk takers and adults are not. right? Adults go to school for a long time. They get jobs. They have mortgages and rent. They have car payments. They have these things called insurance policies. And adults don't like risk, right? And kids like risk. And kids don't care, like, yeah, I'll jump off that roof, right? Like, I'll do something crazy. And I think you need to have a different assessment of risk to be an effective activist. And so even adults who do it have to be less tied, have to be willing to sacrifice things. So if we go back to what we were talking about earlier with the Birmingham case in 1963, the people that first told Martin Luther King, let's let the kids march, understood, oh, kids will do this. Kids will go to jail, because when that campaign started, the idea was we're going to get all these adults to go to jail. And they couldn't get enough adults to go to jail. And the adults didn't want to go to jail because if I go to jail, I'm going to lose my job, right? How am I going to feed my kids? I'm going to get thrown out of my house, right? And the kids are like, I get to not go to school, right? And they're like, where do I sign me up? And so I really think for that's one reason why kids make great activists. I think the other reason is that kids are idealistic. I think young people also understand what's fair and what's not, what's just and what's not. And I think part of being an adult is to learn to ignore injustice to get through the day. You know, if you work downtown and you walk past a homeless person, the first time you do it, you're like, how can there be people that don't have anywhere to live? And the 100th time you walk past it, you're like, oh, there's that homeless guy. And I think adults and sort of adult society needs young people that are like, oh, no, I see that homeless person. When I walk past I don't just walk past that. And if you read about like Greta Thunberg's story, she basically had the thing where she learned about the climate crisis like everybody else, but her response was different. Her response wasn't like, well, that sucks, don't know what's going to happen. She was kind of paralyzed by it. And we need more people that are like, no, this is not okay. And I think kids are really good at being like, this is not okay. We need more people that are saying that.
Right, and they hold so much more power than they realize.
Absolutely.
What would you say to young activists who want to get started?
So I'd say a few things. First, I would say choose a cause that you're really, really passionate about. There are many to choose from. There might be one like at your school that's the super popular one, but if it doesn't speak to you, don't choose it, because being an activist is a lot of work and it's hard, and the novelty of it will wear off at some point, and it's going to be a grind. And if you don't really believe in it, you'll tire out. So that's the first thing. The second is turn it into something that is social as well. So obviously in the best case scenario, if you and your best friends at school are into the same thing, then work together on it. But if you're not, go and try and make friends among the activists, because it's kind of a lifestyle. And if it's a thing that you do that kind of makes you, you know, these are where my friends are, these are my people, that's going to help as well. I would not try and start from scratch. It's overwhelmingly likely that whatever you're interested in, there's organizations that already exist. Join those, make them bigger, make them stronger, give them your energy. The last thing I would say is to know the history. Actually, two more things. The first is know the information about your cause, right? So again, one of the reasons that Greta is so effective is that she really, really understands climate science. And when she talks about it, she's not just like, there's the polar bears and the iceberg. Like, she can tell you the numbers, and she speaks with real authority. So if your cause is criminal justice reform, learn the stats, right? And be able to explain this is wrong and this is why this is wrong. And then the last thing in general is that, you know, study the history of activism in general. It'll make you more effective, and it'll also give you inspiration. You know, you're in the middle of a struggle and a cause that has not yet sort of had enough of its victories yet, but you study these other ones and you've seen that people have won, and that you will need ways to fuel yourself. And so I think if you study the past, it'll help you in the present and kind of propel you into the future.
Right. Yeah, your book absolutely inspired me. It gets really frustrating to keep pushing, especially when you feel so much opposition. As like I'm working on like de facto segregation, and that's such a contentious issue. So it's easy to feel disheartened and just like not feel inspired. But your book really helped me with that.
Well,
Before I
thank
let you
you.
go, I
Yep.
want to leave it open to the audience to ask questions if they have any. So y'all can type down below.
Avery, where are you right now? Are you in Southern California somewhere?
No, no, I literally live in Maryland, like the DC
Oh, in
area.
Maryland. I think I was trying to guess when we were texting your area code. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. So I'm lucky because I'm right there by the Capitol. I can protest
Yeah.
all the time right there. Yeah,
Yeah,
I've been
yeah.
to a ton of climate marches. The Women's March, right? All like in DC.
Yeah. That's excellent. Yeah. Well, I one of the things that kind of worked really nice with the book was that, the way that it's a history book, but you'll notice that the title of the book has all these present tense verbs in it, right? We are power, how activism changes the world. And I really wanted it to work like that somebody reads about all this stuff with the past, but it's like, oh, right? This is all about something I can do now. This isn't just like reading about history to sort of know what happened, but it's really, I read this history so that I can know how to act today in the present.
Right. I think
So
I
let me
see
ask, somebody asked a question, what inspired you to be an activist? I'm going to turn the interview now. You get to answer.
a lot to what you were saying before. I'm just an idealist, and when I recognize an injustice, I wanted to combat that injustice. I believe really deeply in the ideas of equality for all, and I want things to actually be equal for all. I want to see it happen. Um, so yeah, just the idealism that young people have, I absolutely felt that.
And your issue is to try and combat school segregation. Is that what you said?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's a good example. I mean, that's something that's literally institutionalized, right? Like it's literally like we have all these systems in our schools and in our school districts of that reinforce and continue and intensify that injustice, right?
Right.
And if you're going to address that, ultimately you want the institutions to change, but the institutions have shown us like, oh, we're not changing, right? Like we're really good at continuing this. And so
Absolutely.
you have to find a way to go to start outside of that to make them change. And it can be really tricky to figure out, well, how do I do that? Right? And that's the trick, right? But one of the things that, when you study this history, you learn that there's movements that took a really long time and they eventually figured it out. And some of it involves getting society to finally realize like this isn't acceptable. Right. And
Right.
this is another thing that's coming out of the COVID thing is that we're seeing, all these children, their education's going online. And for no one, it's not really very good for anybody. But for some people, it's horrible. They don't have the technology, right? And their home situation is such that it's really hard for them to do the work. And this is something that the activists have to take advantage of to show like, this is what I've been talking about.
Right.
So.
When you were talking about history, that also reminded me of another aspect of why I'm so inspired to fight against de facto segregation. When you look at history, everybody goes, oh, like Brown versus Board of Education, all these things, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, like segregation is over. So I think that was a big component of it for me as well, where I was like, it's like this big secret, like it's not actually over.
Right.
And how can you fight something that's like what's so like pernicious about it? Like how can you fight something if you don't even realize that it exists?
Yeah, no, I remember when I was writing the conclusion to this book, and my editor really wanted me to add a couple paragraphs that were basically saying like, you can think you've won, and you can go backwards, right? Or this kind of injustice that you've been fighting will find another form that it'll take on, and I think that's right. I mean, I think it's hard to think of anything in this country that hasn't kind of in its way been more flexible than racism, right? And we see it all the time. I mean, and sexism is also a similar thing. So there's gains that are made, but that doesn't mean, right? When you've made it illegal for there to be signs that say like white people, here's your drinking fountain, black people, here's your drinking fountain, it's not over, right? And there's always this kind of more work to do. So it's a struggle. It's a struggle, but I think joining the struggle is a way to not sort of be consumed by your anger that there's injustice. I think
Right.
being passive is really dangerous for one sort of spirit, right?
Yeah. And I think our generation is really unique. There's something about this generation. We're not standing for the status quo like we talked about earlier. I think we really are in the midst of social change, and really excited that like I'm going to be in that generation. I'm going to see that we're going to make the change, and that's why it's so important for young activists.
I totally agree, and I'm very hopeful. And if you're wondering, like, do adults look to us to do something? It's yes, adults are hoping that you're going to do something. So you should, don't wait around for the adults to give you permission. Like, push them aside and be like, let me do this. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming. This was a great interview.
Thank you for having me. And again, so glad that the book reached you. And I'm really, I wish you a lot of luck for your projects. Tell me a little bit more about your organization.
Sure. So we're called Students Toward Equitable Public Schools. The acronym is STEPS, which we like because, like, taking like incremental steps to progress. It actually, so we formed around this thing in Montgomery County, the boundary analysis, which is where our school district hired like an external consultant to look at racial diversity, proximity to schools, and utilization, because we've got schools that are like undercrowded and overcrowded right next to each other. So there were all these things that required, like, we need to change our boundaries, but it hadn't happened in 40 years, which is why we had so much buildup, because like the demographics and the size of the student body changed so much. But a big reason that this did not happen is because of fear. There's so much fear around it. People, literally, I'm hearing the same arguments that they say in the 70s, like neighborhood schools and no busing. But literally, a tenet of the boundary analysis is also proximity. Like, they're also looking at proximity to schools. It's not just about, hey, let's like social engineer everything so we can, like, no, it's not about that.
Right.
So
it's
like,
about people worrying about their property values.
exactly.
Is a big part of it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And the Youth Activism Project, are you affiliated with that? Is that a different thing? How does that work?
Yeah, so the Youth Activism Project, they actually helped me get this started. I was just one of many kids who saw the boundary analysis and was like, hey, I want to do something about this, but there wasn't really a student group that had mobilized around it. And then I met the executive director literally at someone's house for like a meeting, like to support the boundary analysis, and we got in contact, and then she helped me just like start this movement and start this coalition. So it was really great because I had the passion, but I didn't have like the direction or anything like that.
That's great. It's such an important cause. It's really important. Well, good luck to you. Keep me posted. Keep me posted.
Absolutely.
And thank you for talking to me. You write books and sometimes no one reads them, so it's good when someone reads them. So let me ask a question, because I don't understand Instagram very well. Is this video that we did right now, is this being recorded anywhere if somebody wants to watch it, or is this like it's there and then it's gone forever?
I'm not actually sure. It depends on like the video. I'm not sure if this one was already recording. It might just be saved. If you want it, I can figure out how to send it to you.
Yeah, just let me know. It's not the biggest deal. I'm just curious.
Okay. Yeah.
But I'm glad this worked.
Me too.
Well, thank you again. Good luck with all your work.
Thanks, you too.
See you around.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one.
You too. Bye.